Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Mark Marquette, and so glad you've joined us today to stay curious. We have got Bob Granath with us today. Bob, a public informations officer, head filled with all kinds of great history of our proud American space
Oh yeah.
program. Bob, welcome.
Well, great to be back.
We're glad to have you back. Bob's going to be on once a month and has got a great program. The 411 is the modern term to say everything you want to know about Kennedy Space Center. He's got a really good program lined up for you here, and I'm going to sit back and enjoy what Bob has to share as a person that saw a tremendous amount of history at the Kennedy Space Center, and like me, a baby boomer that grew up with the good
Yeah.
stuff, the Apollo era, and those
Oh
Gemini
yeah.
boys
Well,
we
I'm
were
a baby
talking
boomer
about.
too,
We
so
were talking about that.
right with it.
Bob, everybody's a little frozen and cold and record snow up in
Oh
Tallahassee.
yeah.
Did you ever think that would happen? The beaches of Pensacola
To
covered in
have
snow?
snow in Florida just sounds like something that's not possible. But
No.
oh yeah, we have friends in Panama City Beach and Tallahassee and Pensacola, all are
What
having
are they
snow.
saying?
Uh, that they can't believe it, but their front yard is white. And we know people in Louisiana, people in Houston, have some of my former colleagues that I worked with at United Space Alliance and the shuttle program. They're showing their front yard with snow. And so it's a really unusual time period. But
They closed
in,
Houston down, the Space Center,
yeah, I heard about
yesterday and
that.
today, and
Yeah.
so forth. And of course, you're going to talk about Kennedy Space Center, and one of the best investments I ever spent at Kennedy Space Center was this hoodie that is my this is my warm blanket here and around here. And you know what it got down to 40s. We got almost 30s in some areas in the middle of the state here. That ain't Dave Stangy cold, where he's up in Macomb, Michigan. Hi, Dave. At minus something is what my mother said it was in Northwest Ohio. So we're going to have a great time today. Might be a question or two, but um, Bob's really got a pretty set program there. So if we find a great question, we'll interrupt you there. Wanted to let you know there's Dave Stangy, Manned Space from Lake Wales, Florida. That is Mitch Rothman. Dean Babcock's in Illinois. My daughter, Jessie, and my granddaughters, Hi McKinley and Macy, are watching today. They're little toddlers, Bob. Cliff Watson's watching from Pomona, Australia. It's
Oh,
Thursday
great.
morning there. He's
Yeah.
having his brekkie,
Yeah.
and it's summertime there too.
Oh yeah.
So people all over the world. Doug Forrest is in Los Angeles, and we've been keeping in touch with Doug, Bob, because he's in Pasadena, and that's what we love here is our Stay Curious family, and we certainly welcome you to it. Uh, want to remind everybody that our astronaut memorial is this Sunday. Andy Allen's doing the honors, and we're going to go live before 1 o'clock. Got Trekkie Techies helping us out with that. Thank you. She helped Marty out with the little snafu this morning. Jessica Galloway, uh, great helper, and we've got Mike Ronaldo. Mike Ronaldo's doing our audio there. So you've been to this. Uh,
Yes.
I get tearful. I think it's really one of the best observances in the country.
Oh, it
Uh,
is.
it's very reverent and patriotic, isn't it, Bob?
That's right. And a lot of people who were involved in the program. And, I was working out at the Space Center when we lost the Challenger crew and then the Columbia crew in 2003. And so with that, it became really personal to me.
Well, and it is personal to a lot of people around here, and that's why I said it's emotional when you put your head around these 17 beautiful human beings
Oh, yeah.
that gave their all for our country, and each one of these tragedies, you were there in the Challenger era and the Columbia era to see us rise from the ashes.
That's right.
It's something to be proud of, right?
Absolutely. When you have something like this, you know things like this will sometimes happen. What makes you great is how you learn from it and rise from it and have a better program because of what you've learned from the mistakes that were made.
Exactly. And so if you get a chance to watch it, it'll be on our YouTube channel to watch anytime also. Got Tom Usiak. He's saying good afternoon from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I'm sure you can probably see his breath outside. We saw John Borelli up in Limestone, New York, minus 3 degrees or something
Ooh,
on
yeah.
his thermometer up there. So, and you know Carlton Bailey, you know
Oh
CB, the
yeah, I know him well.
photographer.
Yeah.
Yeah, CB says hi to you, my good friend Bob. Happy New Year. Hope to meet and greet in person soon. That's
Yeah.
to you. And Steve Jokums is saying hello to Mark, Marty, Bob, and all the Stay Curious gang. Of course, Marty is our my co-producer. We've done 1,205 episodes, I think, in 4 years. We're kind of getting the hang of it, Bob.
Yeah, you're getting to be a veteran.
Yeah, and you knew Bobby. You know Bob. You know Marty because Marty brought you here to Stay Curious. You guys have known each
Oh
other a
yeah,
while.
and of course I've known Marty going back to the days when we were both working for Lockheed.
Yep. And Marty had a great career also with Grumman, working on that lunar module.
That's right.
So we'll have a mission to talk about in February. Apollo 14 is a February mission, Marty, and but we never miss an opportunity to talk about the Apollo era, Bob. It's so important that people remember.
Oh yeah.
With what you think is primitive technology compared to today, look what they did, and no one else has done it, Bob.
That's right. Yeah, no one's duplicated it yet. So we're hoping with Artemis to get astronauts back to the moon, and we do that again. But all of you who carry around something like this,
Yep.
a cell phone, that's NASA technology. And so you carry one of those, you know, you talk on the phone, you're talking to somebody by way of a satellite.
Yes, you are. And these noisy Falcon 9 rockets that go off every 3 days, they're
Yes.
just putting up more cell towers. Is what people
Yeah,
need to
that's
think.
what
Those
it is. That's
satellites
what it
are.
is. Those Starlink satellites, it's
Yeah.
just like that.
They're just cell towers. Well, Bob, I'm looking forward to hearing about a good Kennedy Space Center place that to me is, you know, every time I went to it as a visitor at the visitors complex, you're going to specifically talk about the working environment, but the visitors complex, I always went looking in my rear view mirror going, man, when's the last time I'm going to see this? You know,
Yeah.
as I'm going back to
Yeah.
Tennessee, and today I live here, and sometimes when you're too close to the bone, you forget about how lucky you are to live here. So you're going to remind me a lot of the good heritage here. So everybody sit back. I'm going to turn over here to Bob. Just tell me when to advance it there, Bob, or I'm actually going to
Okay.
show you. You just hit the forward button right there,
All
buddy.
right. That sounds good to me.
And you control your destiny there.
Okay.
So and Marty will go back and forth with the slideshow there.
Okay. Well, at any rate, you know,
Yeah,
The-
here
the forward.
that's the image, and that's forward there.
all right.
All right.
Oh, yeah. All right. Well, I was involved in my church here locally in Titusville, and there was a woman who was very involved in the church named Mariana Triplett. And I asked her one day, how did you get to move to this area of Florida? And she explained that during the late 1940s, she was working in the Pentagon. She was a master sergeant in the Women's Army Corps, and she was involved in the process to transfer millions of men and women out of the military back into civilian life after World War II. And she said in 1948, there was a general who called her in his office, said, I'd like to transfer you to Florida. We want you to help out with a very secret program called the Banana River Project. And she said, okay, well, where is this and what's all going on? He explained, let me turn this off. Technology is wonderful,
Yeah.
except when you get interrupted with something.
Well, you text them back. They need to be watching you on
Yeah.
Stay Curious today,
You
Bob.
know,
The Banana River Project. That sounds pretty top secret.
okay.
And the
Yeah,
Banana
what-
River is the river just 9 miles, just
Just
3 blocks from us.
between
where we
us
sit.
and
No, we're at the
Cape
Indian River.
Canaveral.
That's 9 miles away. Is the Banana
well,
River.
anyway, what he explained is that there were a group of German scientists, engineers, and technicians who had worked on the V2, and they had come to the United States at the end of the war, and they had been working on launching some of the rockets and doing other experiments in the upper atmosphere from the New Mexico desert. And what the government was planning to do was to transfer them from El Paso, where they were at Fort Bliss, to Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama. But they would be launching their rockets from a place called Cape Canaveral. She'd never heard of it. So she looked it up, found out it's a place with a lot of palmetto scrubs, alligators, and mosquitoes. But she wanted to know more. And so she looked up Cape Canaveral, and she found that the Cape was originally explored by the Spanish explorer Juan Ponce de Leon, who is credited with not only being the first European explorer to land in what he named La Florida, he also named the Cape Cabo Canaveral, which is Spanish for Cape of Reeds. And the only thing that was built there at the time that NASA started, or the Army Ballistic Missile Agency started moving in there, was a lighthouse. The lighthouse was originally built in 1847, prior to the Civil War, and it was dismantled during the war and then rebuilt in 1868, and then moved about a mile inland about 1894. And so that lighthouse was the only thing at that particular location when the Army started moving in with its missile agency. At the same time, they decided to reopen the Manava River Naval Air Station. The air station had been there during the Second World War, flying Navy aircraft up and down the east coast of the United States, looking for German U-boat activity. And in fact, I understand that there was an Allied freighter that was sunk right off the point of the Cape. In fact, I've talked to some scuba explorers who have been there and brought about parts from that. In fact, there was a Jeep that was on there destined to go to Europe, and they brought the steering wheel back up. But at any rate, while the Banana River Naval Air Station was operational during the war, of course, on the other side of the Atlantic, there were a group of science experts and rocket people who were very interested in spaceflight and developing rockets, and they had developed what they called the A4 for Aggregate 4, the fourth of their rockets, and it was eventually renamed by the Nazi propaganda ministry to be the V2 for Vengeance Weapon 2.
They're at Peenemünde, the famous.
Yeah, at Peenemünde was the site where they developed it, and what I understand is the technical director for that project was, of course, Dr. Werner von Braun. And when he heard that the SS had taken control of the program and was using it on people, he was horrified because it didn't have a guidance system. He said it was going to take until at least 1946 or 1947 to have the guidance system perfected. So they weren't really concerned about it being used on people until when the SS figured out you can launch it and hit something, they took over the program and started launching it. And so many of them started looking for an opportunity to come over to the United States. And so as the Allies got closer and closer to Germany, they looked for an opportunity to head over and hook up with the Americans. And eventually, 115 of von Braun's colleagues came to the United States, and they were eventually shipped out to Fort Bliss in El Paso, Texas, and they would just go across the state line and launch some of their rockets doing upper atmospheric research. And hopefully they were going to get to a point where they could develop bigger rockets to put satellites into space. And so what then happened as rockets began to get bigger and they began to plan for rockets such as the Redstone, the government decided to move them from Fort Bliss and White Sands to Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama. And they were working under the Army Ballistic Missile Agency. And at the time of that move, von Braun's boss was General John Medeiros, who was the commander of the Army Ballistic Missile Agency. And so they were working there, but the plan was they would actually launch their rockets from Cape Canaveral. And so as they
Medeiros, interestingly, became an Episcopal priest after
That's
his
right.
career.
After it was,
Yeah.
he left the army, he was a priest and remained good friends with von Braun and many of the
Yeah.
colleagues there. But at any rate, they did launch the first rocket from Cape Canaveral, and it was a refurbished V-2 rocket with a U.S. Army WAC corporal on the nose, and this was the first ever operational launch of a two-stage vehicle.
75 years ago this summer.
That's right. So
Yeah.
coming up on the 75th anniversary. And you see, that was July 24 of 1950, and that's when it all began.
Bumper 8 was
Bumper 8.
name. Yep.
Yeah, they had 8 of those V2s they launched with a WAC corporal on the nose as a second stage for even getting higher into the atmosphere, and worked very well. They launched the first 6 from White Sands in New Mexico, and then launched 2 more here at Cape Canaveral.
Those guys are close to it.
And of course, what then happened was the Banana River Naval Air Station was eventually changed to Patrick Air Force Base. It was turned over to the new Department of the Air Force. Up to that point, the Air Force had been a branch of the Army, as the Army Air Force. In fact, my father-in-law served in the Army Air Force in the Second World War. He was involved in training B-27 pilots. But at any rate, in addition to Patrick Air Force Base and launching from Cape Canaveral, there was that string of islands throughout the Pacific, or out throughout the Atlantic Ocean, that served as tracking stations as rockets would go farther and farther downrange as we developed bigger and bigger rockets. Well, after that, there was all manner of rockets being launched
Wow.
and tested from Cape Canaveral, and you can see a sampling of the ones that were going up here. And so throughout the 1950s, bigger and better rockets were being launched, but the big event occurred on January 31st, 1950, when a modified Redstone rocket launched America's first satellite. This, of course, was an answer to the Soviet Union that had launched Sputnik back on October 4, 1956, 1957. And we were looking for a chance to catch up, and so we launched Explorer 1. Sputnik basically was a radio transmitter. It was this ball about the size of a basketball with some antennas. It would orbit the Earth, and it would transmit a beep, and it was just a case of putting a satellite in space. What we did with Explorer 1 is we discovered or confirmed the existence of the Van Allen radiation belts, and named Van Allen because the scientist who developed the instrumentation for that Explorer 1 satellite was Professor James Van Allen of the State University of Iowa, who developed the instrumentation. And as Werner von Braun liked to say, he's the one who believed the radiation belts were there. He developed the instruments, and his satellite is the one that confirms they were there. So he said it's very appropriate that those radiation belts bears his name. Now, at the news conference that took place right after it was confirmed that our satellite was in orbit, von Braun was quoted as saying, "We have firmly established our foothold in space. We will never give it up." And so that's how we got started putting satellites in space. And so we began to continue. And by later on in 1958, President Eisenhower realized we needed a space agency. And so he changed the agency that had been in charge of developing bigger and better aircraft into the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. It had been the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. And so that was changed into NASA. And so very shortly after that, many of the people who had been working for the Army Ballistic Missile Agency transferred to NASA, including the director of the Launch Operations Center here at Cape Canaveral. And that, of course, was Kurt Debus, and he and much of his team then transitioned to the new space agency and began doing work here. Of course, one of the first assignments to the new space agency was to put a human being in space. And so you see here the 7 original Mercury astronauts who were selected to be among the first Americans in space. And the basic plan of Project Mercury was first, put a man in space. But the second thing was, can a human being survive in space? Can you do useful work in space? And so the main purpose of the Mercury program was just simply find out, can humans survive in space?
Now, you grew up with this era, with these larger than life figures in the media back then.
Oh yeah,
Share that with somebody under 50 years old that doesn't realize how these men were so in the news every day, and the dreams were alive.
Oh, absolutely. And when this photograph was first published, who are these guys? Well, there's 3 from the Air Force, there's 3 from the Navy, there's a Marine Corps pilot. They were all fighter pilots. Most of them had flown combat missions in Korea during the Korean conflict. And so people were very interested in, who are these people? Well, one of the things that happened is Life magazine started publishing article after article about these people so that we can learn who they are, who are their families, what are their backgrounds.
They bought the rights to them. They couldn't
that's
talk
right.
to anybody else. So Life magazine was a beautiful photojournalism balanced magazine, oversized.
Oh yeah.
And they're sought after by collectors. $5 to $20 each, probably.
Oh yeah, it's mainly only 75 cents on a newsstand.
Because you're just not talking like a historian. You're talking like somebody that lived during this time, which is exciting.
Oh yeah. When Al Shepard became the first American in space, I was in the 5th grade. So let's see, that was May of 1961. So I was 10 years old.
There you go.
Now, one of the things that was great about that, as I was following it on television as I was getting ready to go to school that day, and so I get to school and the teacher had brought in a television so that we could follow the launch throughout the morning. And in fact, the principal of the school decided she wanted to know if we were actually learning something, so she gave all the students a test to see if we actually had learned anything. The first question on the test was, what's the name of the astronaut that was launched in space today? And so, how many of the students actually remembered that it was...
What'd that TV look like, Bob?
It was a small TV about yay big, black and white.
Yeah.
Of course, all the video coming in was black and white anyway. But, and then a year later, when John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth, we had televisions in our rooms because we sometimes got educational programming in that we could watch. And so my teacher in 6th grade, Mrs. Ann Bell, decided we'd learn more watching the network TV coverage of his flight than we could from anything she could teach that day.
I've been all over schools across America, particularly in Florida.
Oh,
and
yeah.
You're talking about you in Atlanta, where you grew up.
That's right.
Is that right? Yeah. He's an Atlanta Brave fan too, I imagine.
Oh yeah,
because Carlton
Brave,
is Carlton Baylor.
University of Georgia and all that. Sure.
Yeah. Go Dogs.
Yeah.
Well,
there you go.
The FCC's got some work to do as the Big Ten's taken over now the football field.
Well, yeah. but
we're enjoying this conversation with Bob Granath. Hope you are too. And he's given us a great history of Kennedy Space Center. Continue, sir.
All right. Well, as the Mercury program started ramping up, we'd had a couple of test flights without anyone aboard a capsule. And of course, it was January 20 of 1961 when President John F. Kennedy was sworn in.
It's a cool
photo. And he asked Americans to not ask what your country can do for you, but what for you can do for your country.
Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon are to his left seated there.
Yeah, that's right. It's a picture with 4 presidents, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon all seated there. But just 11 days after he was sworn in, the chimpanzee Ham was launched on a Mercury Redstone. And with that flight, it felt like we were pretty close to being ready to launch an American in space to beat the Russians. But what happened is on April 12, we were getting close, but the Russians beat us into space by launching Yuri Gagarin on this Vostok rocket that you see in the left-hand picture. And then just a few days after that was the Bay of Pigs fiasco, in
April
which,
19th. Okay. Let's look at the date there.
oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it was April the 19th of the Bay of Pigs attempted invasion by a bunch of Cubans who had fled Castro's Cuba. That didn't go very well. It was an early embarrassment to the new Kennedy administration. And so, looking for a way to respond, President Kennedy sent a memo to Vice President Johnson. And in it, he said, among other things, do we have a chance of beating the Soviets by putting a laboratory in space, or by a trip around the moon, or by a rocket to land on the moon with a man? Is there any other space program in which promises dramatic results in which we could win? And so they began looking at what are the capabilities? What can we do? How long will it take? How much will it cost? And that, of course, was in that same memo from Kennedy to Johnson.
The date, 10 years later, April 20th, 1971, you know what happened?
Yeah. Yeah.
Apollo 16 landed.
That's right.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And so, very quickly we recovered from all that. But essentially, just a few days after that memo went to President Johnson, Alan Shepard became the first American in space, 15-minute suborbital flight, launched from Cape Canaveral, landed down range in the Atlantic Ocean, and was recovered. And so with a total of 15 minutes experience in human spaceflight, President Kennedy went to Congress on May 25, 1961, and said, let's land a man on the moon and return him safely to the Earth before the end of the decade. And there were even people in NASA who said, can we do this? And of course, the effort then began in earnest. Just a couple of months after that speech, on July 21, 1961, Gus Grissom essentially repeated Alan Shepard's flight, a suborbital mission down the Atlantic Missile Range. And then going in 1962 and 1963, 4 more of the Mercury astronauts flew orbital flights, confirming that, yes, humans can survive in space, and yes, they can do useful work there. And so with that, we're ready to move forward. This photograph, taken November 16, 1963, shows Associate Administrator Robert Siemens, Dr. Werner von Braun, and President Kennedy at Launch Complex 37 at Cape Canaveral. They're looking at a Saturn 1B rocket that was standing on the launch pad, and NASA was explaining to him how we were moving forward on his goal of reaching the moon. Of course, tragically, just a week or so after that picture was taken, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. About a week after the assassination, the new president, Johnson, was in his office in Washington, in the White House, and he was talking to his staff, and he said, we need to come up with a lasting way to honor Kennedy and his memory. And in brainstorming, he said, I think what Kennedy will be best remembered for is setting the goal of going to the moon. So he said, why don't we name that complex down there in Florida where they launched the rockets after Kennedy? So essentially what it is, the map here on the left shows the green area is Cape Canaveral Air Force Station. And then there's the Banana River, and in between the Banana River and the Indian River adjacent to the mainland, the white area on this is what at that time was the NASA Launch Operations Center. This is the land, 140,000 acres, that NASA needed to expand its facilities to develop the Apollo program. On Cape Canaveral was a row of launch pads, mainly for intercontinental ballistic missiles that were being tested and developed, but they needed that additional land. So the Launch Operations Center was on Merritt Island, and that was the NASA center. And so that was named John F. Kennedy Space Center. And at the same time, Cape Canaveral Air Force Station was then changed to Cape Kennedy Air Force Station.
Mhm.
Now, a lot of people say, well, whatever happened to Cape Kennedy? What happened there was a lot of people around this area were thrilled with the idea of the Launch Operations Center being called Kennedy Space Center. But Cape Canaveral had its historic background going back to Ponce de Leon. And so the city of Cape Canaveral, just south of the military base, remained Cape Canaveral. And so it became kind of confusing. And so about 10 years later, about 1973, 1974, there was an effort to rename Cape Kennedy Air Force Station back to Cape Canaveral. And in fact, I understand that people with NASA and the government contacted Senator Edward Kennedy of Massachusetts, the brother of President John F. Kennedy, and said, what do you think? Is the family mind if we rename this? And he said, absolutely, we're thrilled that the Launch Operations Center is named after my brother. By all means, rename the other back to Cape Canaveral. And so that's the way that went. And that's why it's still Cape Canaveral. But a few years back, with the establishment of the United States Space Force, Cape Canaveral became Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, and Patrick became Patrick Space Force Base. And so that's their names now. Now, one of the other things that's kind of interesting about Kennedy Space Center, if you see articles written to the Associated Press style book, you'll see the date line as Cape Canaveral. Well, what this I'm pointing out here is I'm showing you exactly what the Associated Press style book says. It says, located in Cape Canaveral, Florida, NASA's principal launch site for years past and in years to come for manned spacecraft. For date lines on launch stories, say Cape Canaveral, Florida. The Kennedy Space Center is located on Merritt Island. Across the Banana River is Cape Canaveral. And so while often Associated Press stories will say Cape Canaveral, it's actually on Merritt Island where it's located.
Marty tolerated me the first year. I couldn't get that straight, could I, Marty? He was always, particularly the Pad 39A and B are Kennedy Space Center property.
Right.
And you're probably going to talk about that.
Oh, yeah. And then the others, other launch pads are on
AP style manual. I've got mine from the 70s.
But that's always been kind of fun to work through stuff like that.
It is.
Well, at any rate, we went from the Mercury program into the two-man Gemini effort that took place between 1965 and 1966. During that program, we learned how to do long-duration flights up to 8 days and 14 days, learned how to have astronauts get outside the spacecraft and perform what we come to know as a spacewalk, what NASA calls an extravehicular activity. Mm-hmm. And we also learned how to rendezvous and dock with another spacecraft in orbit. And these were all very crucial things we needed to learn and perfect before we could head out to the moon. During the Gemini program, one of the really fascinating achievements was on several occasions we were able to launch 2 rockets the same day. The first time that happened was on March 16, 1966. That's when Neil Armstrong and Dave Scott were launched on the Gemini 8 mission. At 10 o'clock that morning, an Atlas rocket put an Agena vehicle in Earth orbit. And an hour and 41 minutes later, as the Agena was passing over then Cape Kennedy, the Gemini rocket was launched with the 2 astronauts. And after 4 hours, they were able to catch up with the Agena and dock the first rendezvous and docking in space history. But that was significant because several times in the Gemini program we did that, where we launched an Agena and then about 90 minutes later launched 2 astronauts to go rendezvous and dock with it.
Marty said he's got a question there from Carlton Bailey.
Yeah, Carlton's asking, Pad 41 is still on KSC and switches to Cape Canaveral on Pad 40, correct?
that's a good question to ask about. As the launch pads go north up the north on the coast and Cape Canaveral, Pad 40 and everything south of that is technically Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. 41 is actually on the grounds of the Kennedy Space Center. But almost any time we launch from Pad 41, and Pad 41 is the Lockheed Martin and Boeing United Launch Alliance launch pad, where they've launched Atlas rockets and more recently the Vulcan rocket. 41 technically is on Kennedy Space Center. But even though that's the case, we almost always refer to it as being at Cape Canaveral. But Carlton is right. Pad 41 is technically on the grounds of the Kennedy Space Center.
Thank you, Carlton and Marty. That's interesting.
Yeah, good catch.
There you go. Go ahead. Yeah, Marty's helping.
All right.
Marty and I are helping each other there. Go ahead and make
All
it
right.
big there, Marty.
During the days of the Gemini program, there was a lot of construction going on at the Kennedy Space Center. The biggest thing going up in what we refer to as the industrial area was the vehicle assembly building.
Look at that photo. Wow, that's
Yeah,
nice.
as you can see, the foundation was built on 4,225 steel pilings, each 16 inches in diameter, driven to 160 feet to bedrock. And so that building was going up to support the Saturn V rockets that would take astronauts to the moon. And one of the important buildings going up in what we call the industrial area, at the time it was the Manned Spacecraft Operations Building. Today it's called the Neil Armstrong Operations and Checkout Building.
But back in the day, it was actually the vertical assembly building.
Yeah, in the early days, it was some people referred to it as the vertical assembly building, and others called the vehicle assembly building. Vehicle assembly building is the name that eventually stuck.
Yeah.
But
Good one,
yeah, that's
Marty.
true.
And then there was the SOB,
Yeah,
Spacecraft Operations Building. Changed to
Yeah.
MSOB.
oh yeah, yeah. But what was happening as we continued on building up at Kennedy Space Center?
By the way,
Rock-
go back there a second,
Okay.
Bob.
Go back.
The launch control center there, too,
Oh.
being built there.
Okay.
This is really a great photo.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And
Well,
the LCC's the lower building there with the white
Yeah.
sides on it. There,
that's right.
where,
Yeah, it's a four-story
Marty
building,
was,
and
you've been in there a lot watching
Oh,
launches
yeah,
and stuff
we've-
like that.
yeah,
So
been in there.
thank you
But
for,
yeah, that's true.
well, Marty got the arrow out there.
Well, as rockets got bigger,
Oh.
this is a photograph of Werner von Braun in his office where he was director of the Marshall Space Flight Center, and has many of the launch vehicles that he'd worked on. And as you see, the three Saturn I rockets are pretty big. And to keep everything in scale, the Saturn V, they had to cut a hole in the ceiling
Yeah,
so that it could keep going up
that's
and
it.
stay in scale with all the other rockets that he'd worked on in the
I
past.
counted 14 there real quick, Bob.
Yep.
And
But,
they have that office recreated in Huntsville.
Oh yeah, they do.
Yeah.
Well, this shows the first test Saturn V rolling out to the launch pad. The vehicle assembly building is something you can see from almost anywhere in Brevard County, especially if you're along the Indian River. It's 525 feet high, is 716 feet long and 518 feet wide, and covers 8 acres. And in volume at 129 million cubic feet, it's one of the largest buildings in the world. And in fact, when it was completed, it was the largest building in the world. And there's all kinds of gee whiz things about that. But what I remember from the first time I took a bus tour back in 1966, the bus driver doing the tour said you could put Yankee Stadium on the roof and still have room to park about 2,500 cars. So it's that big.
Huh.
And
Look
so
at the Saturn V rolling out. You got 2 other launch umbilical towers
that's right.
in the background there.
And it almost shrinks the launch control center where you can barely see it, but it's a
right in the
4-story building.
foreground, all those
They're
cars.
adjacent to the VAB.
Beautiful, rare photo there, Bob.
Yeah. Well, what I remember most about the first Saturn V launch, it was unmanned, November 9, 1967. It was watching the coverage by Walter Cronkite. And did he get excited? It takes a few minutes, or a few seconds rather, for the sound of that rocket to get back to the press site about 3 miles away. But he said it was about 130 decibels. It was one of the loudest things that was. He said he remembered the first time he was allowed to attend a firing of an atomic bomb in a test. And he said that was a weapon of war. This was just as loud, but it was a vehicle of peaceful space flight. But he really got excited. He said, the building is shaking. The roar is terrific.
He's behind that window there, and he's CBS
right.
News.
Yep.
Yeah.
He's sitting there in front of that window and calling that. But his emotion in covering that first launch of a Saturn V really gave you an idea. We have taken an expeditious step in developing bigger rockets to have bigger missions.
I think he's really saying, Bob, I'm scared out of my mind. We're way too close.
Well, what I remember in that, he said after everything settled down, the thing was up, out, and heading towards orbit, he explained that he and one of his producers were holding that big plate glass window because they thought it was going to fall
really?
right in on them. And so he was hoping that as they held it, when it fell, it would fall out, not on their heads. It didn't fall out, but it was just another one of those things that just showed you we're talking about a really big rocket.
Walter Cronkite, at one time in the 1970s, considered the most trusted man in America.
Yes.
In there.
Yeah.
For those under 50 years old out there.
You want to tune in the news, Walter Cronkite says it, you can say you can believe it.
Yep.
Well, 2 launches later for the Saturn V, there were people on board. Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders, the crew of Apollo 8, were launched the first mission to the moon. What had happened is we were getting ready for the first manned flight in the Apollo program, Apollo 7. Some of our CIA satellites detected that the Soviet Union was building a super rocket approximately the size of a Saturn V. And they said they were doing testing that showed they were getting close to having a manned loop around the moon. And if that cosmonaut did that, even if he didn't go into orbit, even if he didn't land, they could say, we got to the moon first. So the decision was made, let's go ahead and launch this crew and go out and orbit the moon 10 times. And it was launched on December 21st. And as they were going back, they became the first to show us pictures of what the Earth looks like. And I always remember what Jim Lovell said during that flight. The Earth from here is a grand oasis in the big vastness of space. And of course, later on, Bill Anders, when they were in lunar orbit, took the picture that we know as Earthrise. And when he was questioned about that, he said, you know, we came all this way to study the moon, and what we did is we discovered the Earth. Many people look at these photographs that the Apollo 8 mission brought back and other Apollo missions as being one of the things that was an impetus for the environmental movement that began with the first Earth Day in 1970. And so it was a chance to look back at Earth and see what our planet looks like as a beautiful blue marble in the blackness of space. And you kind of realize we need to take care of our home planet. And so I think people, because of that, have been much more focused on environmental issues and taking care of our home planet. Well, that was December of 1968. By the time you got into July, we were ready to launch that first manned flight to the moon. On July 20, 1969, Apollo 11 landed on the moon with Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, and he stepped on the lunar surface and made that quote of, that's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. And we had accomplished it. We met the goal of landing on the moon. And actually, we landed on the moon twice before the end of 1969. Apollo 12 duplicated that a little later on. And in fact, during the years of the Apollo program, between 1969 and 1972, we had 6 moon landings, putting 12 astronauts on the moon. And this is a photograph of Jim Irwin during Apollo 15. You can see his lunar rover parked off to the side. And over the period from 69 to 72, we had those missions where we could really do some serious study of the moon. But of course, main impetus goes back to the Cold War and the politics. But yes, Apollo was also a chance to do some real science, to go to another heavenly body. And I remember at one point, Mike Collins, who was the command module pilot on Apollo 11, was asked, sum up what Apollo was about. And he said, the Apollo program was about leaving, just going out, leaving Earth and showing that we can go land on another heavenly body and explore and come back and show the pictures.
Mm-hmm. Excellent.
So
Excellent.
to continue to use Apollo era hardware, after the final Apollo moon landing mission, we began Skylab using a lot of Apollo hardware. Skylab became America's first rudimentary space station. It was up there from May of 1973, and it was staffed 3 separate times through February of 1974. There were crews that stayed in successively longer periods. Started out with 28 days, the second crew there for 59, and the third crew stayed up for 84 days, almost 3 months. And it gave a chance to study the Earth, use that, looks like a windmill, but that's solar panels on the Apollo telescope mount. There's a telescope that would look back at the sun and give us more and more information about the sun above the disturbances of the atmosphere, and give us really good solid pictures for study by astronomers back here on Earth. And so when the Skylab program ended, we had one more Apollo flight where we rendezvoused and docked with a Soviet Soyuz. And by the time we got through flying the Saturn vehicles, we had launched between 1967 and 1975, 13 Saturn V's and 4 Saturn 1B's from Launch Complex 39A and B at Kennedy Space Center.
Marty's got a question that
All right.
pertains to the Saturn V's.
Yeah, Dean Babcock is asking, how many unmanned tests of the Saturn V were originally scheduled?
Well, we actually flew 2 unmanned flights, but originally there was a thinking that you would test each stage separately. And what that would have required, 2 successful launches with only the first stage being live, then 2 more launches with the first and second stage live, and then 2 more launches with first, second, and third stages live. And then with that, you feel like it's safe enough to start flying it for real. Well, one of the things Dr. George Miller, who was the associate administrator for human spaceflight during the Gemini program and most of Apollo, he started looking at that schedule coming out of the Marshall Space Flight Center, and he met with Dr. von Braun, and he said, we can't meet President Kennedy's goal of landing on the moon by the end of the decade if we have that many unmanned flights. Let's do all full up from the start with all the stages live from that first mission. And von Braun said, I think you're right. Now, when he went back and told some of his colleagues back at the Marshall Center, they said, what? But eventually that is what we went with. And of course, it was successful.
George Miller, really another hidden figure.
Oh, yeah.
In the management. That was a huge decision, and he really lobbied for that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, he did. And I think once he really sat down and explained the rationale with Dr. von Braun, he agreed, that's the way we ought to go.
Mueller.
That's
pronounced
right.
Miller, though.
Yeah. I had a chance to meet him. It was the day after the space shuttle launch with John Glenn aboard.
Uh-huh.
He was one of our guests of United Space Alliance, and he was interested in getting into the vehicle assembly building to see what it looks like now. And so I had the privilege of doing that tour
Oh,
with he
really?
and his wife.
Huh.
And so what was cool about that is when we went in the vehicle assembly building, I'm explaining how it's set up for a shuttle, and then he explained to me how it was set up for Apollo. And then we got out to one of the shuttle launch pads. I was explaining how it's set up for shuttle. Then he explained to me how it was set up for Apollo.
Huh.
And so it was a tour where I learned as much from my
Yeah, that's interesting.
tour subject as he may have learned from me.
George Miller, a true legend, and
Oh,
a
absolutely.
partner with George Webb. Jim Webb.
Jim
and
Webb,
him,
yeah.
They were at Capitol Hill all the time getting money.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Well, thank you. I'm really enjoying this. Thanks for your questions. We're on the home stretch here of a history of Kennedy Space Center. And Bob Granath is doing such an awesome job. The graphics are beautiful. And he has so limited notes, folks. This is right out of his head. And I respect that a lot, Bob.
All right.
Go right ahead, buddy.
Okay. Well, after the Apollo program was completed, we went to work and modifying the vehicle assembly building and a lot of other facilities to support the space shuttle program. And so on April 12th, 1981, we launched STS-1, the first space shuttle, flew for 2 days, landing at Edwards Air Force Base in California on April the 14th. And the irony is that was launched on the 20th anniversary of the birth of human spaceflight. It's the 20th anniversary of Yuri Gagarin's Vostok flight back in 1961. But in addition to modifying existing facilities, it meant building some new ones, including a landing facility where the shuttles could come back and land here at the Kennedy Space Center. And that picture on the left shows a space shuttle landing with the launch pad there in the background. It was the first time that a human space flight returned to the place where it started. And of course, it also required building hangars for the orbiters. We had eventually 3 bays of what we called the orbiter processing facility, where you could take the orbiters in and work on them between missions, make repairs, make modifications for future space flights. And so there was a lot of additional facilities built to support shuttle. The biggest achievements of the space shuttle program, the first one was orbiting the Hubble Space Telescope. That was put in orbit in 1990, and it completely rewrote the astronomy books. And of course, the James Webb Space Telescope that's at work now is rewriting the things that Hubble told us. But orbiting that huge telescope, getting it above the distortion of the Earth's atmosphere, gave scientists and astronomers a much better view of what's out in deep space. Another achievement of the shuttle program, a major achievement, was construction of the International Space Station. And that required a new building in the industrial area, the Space Station Processing Facility. There's a picture of the exterior and interior where many of the modules are being prepared, and that helped us get ready for the missions to construct it in space.
Acronym SSPF there. SSPF is floated around all the time there.
Oh, yeah.
And you used to be able to take a tour and look inside there where the windows are. I actually did that, Bob. You might remember that. And then
Oh, yeah, I remember the days of doing
after
that.
9/11, they didn't do that. But yeah, up there at those windows, you could look down and see the space workers there. Yes, we got another question, Marty.
Dean Babcock is asking, when did the KSC Visitor Center first open?
Well, the first bus tours of the Kennedy Space Center began in the summer of 1966. A year later, they built the what they called the Visitor Information Center. It was just 2 small buildings with a breezeway attaching it. But that visitor center has been expanded and expanded over the years into a very fabulous complex that it is now.
Mm-hmm.
And it includes museums where you can see a flown Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo spacecraft.
Mm-hmm.
You have the Spatial Atlantis facility where you can see the Spatial Atlantis set up as it appeared when it was in space. And then there's another building that has the Orion spacecraft that flew on the EFT mission that flew in 2014, the first flight of an Orion spacecraft in Earth orbit in a test flight. And
The
so
Gateway
the
building.
Gateway
Yeah.
facility, that's right. And they have an IMAX theater that has some spectacular films that they run. And so they began the bus tours in 1966, and they began constructing the visitor center in 1967.
Thanks for your question there, Dean. And Tom Celentano said he's enjoying this interesting history from Robert Granath. And I am too. So we're getting,
All right.
there are
Well, once we,
slides there. Yeah, Marty's going to hit that slide for you.
Yeah, there we go. So once we had the ability to start launching elements of the space station, this is a photograph astronauts took as they approached on one of the final space shuttle missions. And the International Space Station has been staffed now constantly since October of 2000. So you got 25 years when people have been constantly in space. And so you have people now who have graduated from college, and there has never been a day when there haven't been people in space. And it just shows how far we have come.
It's amazing and nothing to be, it's really to be credit to the whole program.
Oh,
Yes,
yeah,
Marty.
it's fascinating just when you think of how far we have come from
Mm-hmm.
1903, the Wright brothers
I
had
know.
the first flight.
Yeah,
By 1969, we're on the moon.
66 years later.
And then in 2000, we have people constantly living and working in space.
Yeah. Marty, you could probably answer that question from Dean Babcock.
I probably could, but I can't. Anyway, the question is the SSPF still utilized? And yes, it is, but I forget what it's utilized for.
Yeah, the space station building, while all the elements are up there on the station now, a lot of the supplies that are being sent up on the resupply missions and stuff going up with the astronauts who are going to the station are processed and prepared in that building. And so the SSPF is still very much active, preparing elements to go up to the space station. And there's a lot of crucial experiments that are being prepared in that building to this day.
Thank you. We've got Stanislaus Skornia. Thank you for watching from Mexico City. And their question is, what will happen with the Launch Complex 37?
Right now, I don't know of any specific plans for Complex 37, but one of the things about all of these facilities that are available, NASA's been looking for ways to, does NASA want to use it, or does it want to turn it over to industry?
They're up for lease, a lot of them. They're up for
Oh, yeah.
lease, and
That's right.
Musk and Bezos are paying a lease
Oh, yeah.
on the pads that they
Right.
work
And we'll get to that in a moment.
from. Okay.
But
Well, go
from
ahead and roll with it.
from
there, Bob.
1981 to 2011, we had 135 space shuttle launches from Kennedy Space Center. And so once that passed, Bob Cabana and was our center director, and Janet Petro, our deputy director. And now what do you do? What do you do with the facilities? What do you do with the workforce? And Bob Cabana started working on a concept for creating a multi-user spaceport. And so he and Janet Petro began working on that. And so what do you do with the infrastructure? Just on
Wow, look at all that.
the infrastructure for communication systems, there's 800 miles of cabling, 15,000 telephones, 2,400 radios, 10,000 paging speakers. There's all of these systems that are a part of the infrastructure. You have the buildings, you have the launch pads. What do you do with all these? Well, Launch Complex 39 was turned over to SpaceX in 2014, and they began preparing that for their Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy rockets. And of course, in July of 2017, they had the first Falcon 9 launch, sending a resupply mission to the International Space Station. And you go throughout the Kennedy Space Center. The shuttle landing facility has now been turned over to Space Florida. 2 of the bays of the orbiter processing facility were turned over for Boeing for processing their X-37B mini shuttle. Blue Origin has built a massive complex right outside the gates of the Kennedy Space Center. Of course, just a few days ago, they had their first successful launch of their New Glenn rocket.
Did you see it?
I did see it, and
Your
it was
reaction.
spectacular.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a big rocket. It's almost as tall as the Saturn V. Saturn V was 363 feet. The New Glenn is 322 feet. And it has a thrust of 3,800,000 pounds of thrust.
Excellent,
So it's a
Bob.
powerful, very capable of rocket.
Yeah. Yeah. And that Blue Origin photo.
Yeah.
There, they
Yeah.
built already behind there.
Oh, yeah.
All that
That's an old picture,
Yeah,
and,
that's about a 3-year-old picture. It's
yeah.
amazing what that complex.
Oh, yeah.
looks like.
It's fascinating what they've been able to build. And, they're serious about the work to come.
Yep.
And of course, one of the things about Kennedy Space Center right now is we have 3 human spaceflight programs in progress right now. We have SpaceX been launching Crew Dragons since 2020, sending astronauts to the space station. We've had one crew launch on a Boeing Starliner. They're working to solve some of the issues they had on their first human flight there. And of course, Lockheed Martin is the contractor for the Orion spacecraft that will take astronauts to the moon. So there's a lot of things going on. That first launch from the Kennedy Space Center since the final shuttle mission took place in 2020 when 2 astronauts were launched on a Crew Dragon.
Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley there on the left.
That's right. And then, of course, you have
Crew 9.
the Crew 9 astronauts, Alexander Gubarov and Nick Hagee,
Yep.
on their way out to the launch pad. And so this has been very successful. And then, of course, when we got into December of 2022, we had the first uncrewed flight of the Orion spacecraft on top of a Space Launch System rocket. A very successful mission. We're studying the results of that, getting ready for the first flight of sending 4 astronauts to go loop around the moon, hopefully in April of next year, 2026. And so this is another one of the exciting things going on. And of course, this is the crew for that Artemis II mission.
Yeah.
Reed Weissman, Victor Glover, Christiana Cook, and the Canadian astronaut Jeremy Hansen during their training at the Kennedy Space Center, and they'll be launching on the Space Launch System rocket. And getting back to some of the things going on now, SpaceX is building what they call Hangar X, where they'll be processing not only Falcon 9s and Falcon Heavies, but the Starship that will be used to take astronauts to the lunar surface. And in addition,
I've got a comment there from Steve Jokums. He says there's talk about LC-37 becoming a Starship launch site, and he's absolutely true about that. And our executive director, Gabriel Rothblatt, and myself are getting communications for community forums. They're sorting this out. I've already read like 12 pages of restrictions and stuff like that. They're getting out there the environmental impact from the sound to animals and stuff like that is going on right now, Steve. And it's a pretty huge rocket. They're pretty close.
Oh yeah,
so you and Marty know better than I do. But
yeah, well, the Starship is the biggest rocket ever built.
Right. Yeah.
And
8
so
million pounds
it's
of
going to be
thrust and-
spectacular. And in fact, this is a launch from Pad 39A, but you see a tower right adjacent to it. and that's being built as a Starship
Mhm.
launch pad as well. Um, and so they're looking to have a couple of places to launch, and this one's going to be big. And
Yeah.
in fact, if you can see how the Starship tower is taller than the tower that's used for the Falcon
Yeah,
9
how
now.
big. You can see it from anywhere you look off when you're looking over to VAB. So
That's right.
yeah, kind of a Nova class. Steve is saying that was the
That's right.
Saturn was the next level. The von Braun one was called Nova,
That's right.
and that pad was going to be where Playa Linda beaches are, right?
Right. It would have been pad 39C if they'd built it.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, and that would have impacted Playa Linda a good bit.
All right.
So beyond that, talking of the Starship, that will be one of our craft that will take astronauts down to the surface of the moon. Processing that at Kennedy Space Center, and of course, at the same time, NASA has a contract with Blue Origin for their Blue Moon lander. We'll have two different spacecraft that can take astronauts from the Gateway Space Station in lunar orbit down to the lunar surface.
They built, Bob, the big parking garage that you've seen holds 400 cars
Oh yeah,
at Blue Origin's campus there. And when you drive by there, the one that's all scaffolding right now,
right.
that's for the Blue Origin to build it. I talked to some people that
Yeah.
work out there now pretty frequently, including a
Oh,
neighbor.
And
So,
that will be built right here on the Space Coast. And
Yeah,
so,
now that looks more like chances of landing on the moon, because you get the legs way out there, and
yeah.
like Marty's Grumman lunar module was there. So, Bob, outstanding. Here's you want to know more or see other programs of Bob? He has spaceagechronicle.com. All right, and kudos to you, sir. Very great graphics, and like I said,
Yeah.
Bob has limited number of notes here, and that impresses me too. And it's a good hedge against Alzheimer's there, keeping all this stuff fresh out
Oh
there,
yeah,
isn't
yeah.
it? Keep your mind. Well, thank you all for watching today. Again, we have Doug Forrest, Dave Stange. Why don't you read off the other names they're watching?
All
today?
right, we got Mitch Rothman, Dean Bobrook, Babcock.
Yeah.
Okay, Jesse Q.
That's my daughter.
Okay. Cliff Watson, Tom
Celentano.
Stellantano. Okay. Carlton Bailey, Tom Usiak, Steve J, Bill Whiting.
And
You want to read that last one there?
well, Stanislaw Skornia.
Oh yeah, okay.
Oh, Stanislaw
Stanislaw,
there
yeah.
watching from Mexico.
Well, glad y'all are watching.
So we've covered about Australia, Mexico, Europe, a couple continents there. Episode 1206 in the book.
In the book.
And thank you so much.
All right.
What an asset you are to the program here. I think everybody agrees that they learned a little bit of something that they thought they knew about or didn't know about.
Yeah.
So Bob, we welcome you back in February. Marty, tomorrow and Friday we're going to do some remembrance type stories, looking at the fallen Apollo Challenger and Columbia astronauts in a positive light.
Very
And
good.
we don't talk too much about the actual tragedies. There's books and documentaries out there galore, so to see what happened. We want to emphasize that the spirit of these astronauts lives on, doesn't it, Bob?
Absolutely.
And you were at the forefront promoting that in your PAO. Well,
Oh, yeah.
what does it? They call it NASA's darkest week. Put a perspective on that for us from your job as telling the world about these things.
Well, when you get in this business, you know this is something that can happen. And you try to prepare for it and do everything you can to make sure it doesn't happen. But when it does, you know that these are not just supermen and superwomen. They're people just like we are. I had a chance to get to know all the members of the 51L crew that we lost on Challenger, especially Dick Scobie, who was the commander. The way he and I kind of linked is his wife is named June. My wife is named June. We started discussing how we met our wives in college. Turned out he met his wife under very similar circumstances to the way I met my wife. And so
Which is what?
Well,
Blind date or
well, no,
arrangement,
actually,
or-
the way I met, I was going to the University of West Georgia in Carrollton, Georgia, about 60 miles west of Atlanta. I went to a Baptist Student Union meeting, sat in one evening, looked across the aisle, just as the meeting was supposed to start, and I saw one of the most attractive young ladies I've ever seen. And so after the meeting was over, I was across the aisle in about 0.2 seconds to meet her. And we started dating shortly after that and eventually married. Been married now 50 years. Dick Scobie told me, he said, well, he was going to college outside of Seattle, Washington. And a local church had a activity for some of the students there. And he went and he met this gal named June. They started dating and eventually married. And so that was just sort of a way we
What a
kind of
great
connected.
story! What a
But,
great story! This is
The thing that I remember most about him is I was traveling with him and members of the 41C crew. That was the mission where they went up and worked on the Solar Max satellite.
okay.
And everywhere they went in various work areas, they had something set up where the astronauts could speak. Dick Scobie is humble. And so they everywhere we went, and there was a microphone. Okay, Dick, you're gonna have to speak this time. And so of course he did. And he said, "You don't like speaking?" And he said, "Hey, look, I'm just flying this thing. These guys who are the mission specialists, Pinky Nelson, Oxford Houghton, Terry Hart, they are the ones that are going to make the space shuttle special. I'm just the one who flies it." And I'm thinking, it takes a lot to fly that thing. He and Bob Crippen were Crippen was the commander. He was the pilot on that mission. But he was just so humble and wanted to put the credit on the mission specialists who were doing all the spectacular things on the flight. And so that's my memory of Dick Scobie as somebody with humility and wanting to give credit to somebody else.
Well, thank you, Bob, again for sharing these wonderful stories. This is why we
Right.
do it, folks, on Stay Curious, is you hear gems like this that you will never hear anywhere else. So we're looking forward to Bob coming back next week. And Tom Celentano says June Scobie Rogers, an inspiration to so many others.
Yes.
And Steve Jokums goes along with that. So
Yeah, I had a chance to meet her at a reunion of the class of astronauts that was selected in 1978, and just a wonderful woman.
yeah. Well, she's part of everybody's hearts this week, particularly with the memorial that will be Thursday morning. Tomorrow morning, we're going to go out and do the flowers on the mirror is tomorrow morning. We'll be back and talk about a little bit that tomorrow too. So again, thanking this new friend of the American Space Museum, Robert Granath, for a wonderful program. Tell your friends to watch it on our YouTube channel here. They won't regret getting a great history lesson. And everybody says thank you for what you're doing there, including 2834 jumped in there, Marty. So Marty, great job you did today, and we're going to crank it up tomorrow and Friday for y'all folks. Until then, I'm Mark Marquette saying on behalf of Bob, we can't wait to see you again to bridge the space between us.